Hello ma'am, my name is Novita Desriana Girsang. My student ID number is 203010201016. Now I want to fulfill my final test, that's to read a story that you have given us with the title is The Monkey's Paw. I'll start. The Monkey's Paw, a short story by W. Jacobs. Without, the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlor of Lexnam Villa the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and son went at chess, the former, who posed ideas about the game involving radical change, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady knitting placidly by the fire. "Hard at the wine," said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said the latter, dreamily surveying the bird as he stretched out his hand. "Check. And I should hardly think that he'd come tonight," said his father, with his hand poised over the bird. "And then the white mat," replied the son. "That's words of living so far out," bawled Mr. White, with sudden and unlooked for violence. "All of the beastly, slushy, out of the way place to live in. This is the worst. Pathways a bog, and the roads a torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only 2 houses on the road are left, that thing it doesn't matter." "Never mind, dear," said his wife soothingly. "Perhaps you will win the next one." And Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin in his thin grey beard. And then Mr. White said, "There he is," said Herbert White, as the gate banged too loudly and heavy footsteps came toward the door. And the old man rose with hospitable haste, and opening the door, was heard condoling with a new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Mrs. White said, "Toot toot," and cawed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall burly man, beady of eye and rubicund of visage. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, introducing him. And Mr. White said the sergeant major shook hands, and taking the proffered seat by the fire, watched contentedly while his host got out whiskey and tumblers and stood a small copper candle on the fire. At the third glass his eyes got brighter, and he began to tell the little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor. From distant part, as he squared his bird shoulder in chair and spoke of strange scan and doughty deeds, of wars and plagues and strange people. 21 years of it," said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son. "When he went away he was asleep off a yacht in a warehouse. Now look at him. "He don't look to have taken much harm," said Mrs. White, politely. "I'd like to go to India myself," said the old man, "just to look around a bit, you know." "Better where you are," said the sergeant major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and sighing softly, shook it again. "And then I should like to see those old temples and fakers and jugglers," said the old man. "What was that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw, or something, Maurice?" "And nothing," said the soldier hastily. "Leastway, nothing worth hearing." "Monkey's paw," said Mrs. White curiously. And the Mrs. White said, "Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic perhaps," said the sergeant major offhandedly. His three listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips, and then set it down again. His host filled it for him. "To look at," said the sergeant major, fumbling his pocket. "It's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy." He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but Harrison, taking it, examined it curiously. "And what is there special about it?" inquired Mr. White, as he took it from his son, and having examined it, placed it upon the table. "And, Mr. White, it had a spell put on it by old man Faker," said the sergeant major. "A very holy man. He wants to show that faith rules people's life, and that those who interfere with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it." His manner was so impressive that his hearers were conscious that their light laughter jarred somewhat. "Well, why don't you have 3, sir?" said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier regarded him into the way that middle-aged is wont to regard presumptuous wealth. "I have," he said quietly, and his blocky face whitened. "And did you really have the 3 wishes granted?" asked Mrs. White. "I did," said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. "And has anybody else wished?" inquired the old lady, and the Mr. White said the first man had 3 wishes. "Yes," was the reply. "I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for to die, and that's how I got the paw." His tones were so grave that a house fell upon the group. "If you've had 3 wishes, it's no good to you, then, Maurice," said the old man at last. "What do you keep for?" The soldier shook his head. "Fancy, I suppose," he said slowly. I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused enough mischief already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's a fairy tale, some of them. And those of doing anything of it want to try it first and pay me afterward. If you could have another 3 wishes, said the old man, eyeing him narrowly, would you have them? I don't know, said the other. I don't know, and I don't know. And then he took the paw, and dangling it between his front finger and thumb, and suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. Better let it burn, said the soldier solemnly. If you don't want it, Maurice, said the old man, give it to me. And I won't, said his friend doubtfully. I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire again, like a sensible man. The other shook his head and examined his new position closely. How do you do it? He inquired. Hold it up in your right hand and whiz aloud, said the sergeant major, but I warn you of the consequences. Sounds like the Arabian Nights, said Mrs. White as she rose and began to set the supper. Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me? And her husband drew the talisman from his pocket, and then all 3 burst into laughter as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm. If you must wish, he said gruffly, wish for something sensible. Mr. White dropped it back into his pocket, and placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the 3 sat listening in enthralled fashion to a second installment of Solder's adventures in India. If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he has been telling us, said Herbert as the door closed behind their quest, just in time for him to catch the last train. We shan't make much of it. And Mr. White said, did you give him anything for it, father? Inquired Mrs. White, regarding her husband closely. A trifle, said him, coloring slightly. He didn't want it, but I made him take it, and he pressed me again to throw it away. Likely, said Herbert, with pretended horror. Why, we're going to be rich, and famous, and happy. Wish to be an emperor, father, to begin with, then you can't be handpicked. He darted around the table, pursued by a malignant Mrs. White arms with an antimacassar. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously. I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fake, he said slowly. It seems to me I've got all I want. If you only clear my house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you? Said Herbert, with his hand on his shoulder. Well, whispered £200, then that's all, just do it. And his father, smiling shamefacedly at his own credulity, held up the talisman as his son, with a solemn face somewhat marred by a wink at his mother, sat down at the piano and struck a few impressive chords. I wish for £200, said the old man distinctly. A fine crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupted by the shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran toward him. It moved, he cried with a glance of distrust at the object as it lay on the floor. As I wish it twisted in my hand like a snake. Well, I don't see the money, said his son as he picked it up and placed it on the table. And I bet I never sold. It must have been your fancy, father, said his wife, regarding him anxiously. He shook his head. Never mind, Doug, there is no harm done. But it gave me a shock all the same. They sat down by the fire again while the two men finished their pipes. Outside the wind was higher than ever, and the old man started nervously at the sound of the door banging upstairs. A silence unusual and depressing settled upon all there, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the night. I expect you'll find the cats tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed, said Herbert, as he bade them good night, and something horrible squatting up on top and wardrobe watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains. In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, Herbert laughed at his fear. There was an awe of prosaic wholesomeness about the room which it had looked on the previous night, and the dirty, sleeve little PAW was pitched on the sideboard with a carelessness which betokened no great belief in its virtues. I suppose old men soldiers are the same, said Mrs. White. The idea of our listening to such nonsense, how could wish to be granted in those days? And if they could, how could £200 hurt you, father? Mike dropped on his hat from the sky, said the frivolous Herbert. Maurice said the things happen so naturally, said his father, that you might, if you so wish, attribute it coincidence. Well, don't break into the money before I come back, said Herbert, as he rose from the table. I'm afraid it'll turn you into a various man, and we shall have to disown you. His mother laughed and, following him to the door, and watched him down to the road, and returning to the breakfast table, was very happy at the expense of her husband's credulity, all of which did not prevent her from scurrying to the door at the postman's knock. nor prevent her from referring somewhat shortly to retired section major of Bibel's habit, when she found that the pause broke a tailor's bill. Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home, she said as they sat at dinner. And Mr. White, I dare say, said him, pouring himself out some beer. But for all that, the thing moved in my hand. That all swear to. You took it dead, said the old lady soothingly. And Mrs. White said him, I said it did, replied the other. There was no doubt about it. I had just, what's the matter? And his wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movement of a man outside, who, peering in an undecided fashion at his house, appeared to be trying to make up his hand enter, in mental connection with the 200 pounds. She noticed that a stranger was well dressed and wore a sleeve, had a glossy newness. 3 times he paused again, and then walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand upon it, and then with sudden resolution flung it open, and walked up the path. Mrs. White at the same moment placed her hand behind her, and hurriedly unfastening the string of her apron, put that useful article of upper benefit and cushion of her chair. She brought a stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into the room. He gazed furtively at Mrs. White, and listened in a preoccupied fashion as the old lady apologized for the appearance of the room, and her husband's coat, a German which her usually reserved for the garden. She then waited as patiently as her sex would permit for him to broach his business, but he was at first strangely silenced. I was asked to call, he said at last, and stopped and picked a piece of cotton from his trouser. I come from Mau and Majon. The old lady started. Is anything the matter? She asked breathlessly. Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it, and what is it? Her husband interposed. There, mother, he said hastily. Sit down and don't jump to conclusion. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir, and he eyes that other wistfully. I'm sorry, began the visitor. Is he hurt? Demanded the mother. And Mr. White said, the visitor bowed in assent. Badly hurt, he said quietly, but he is not in any pain. Oh, thanks God, said the old woman, clasping her hands. Thanks God for that. Thanks. She broke off suddenly as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned upon her, and she saw the awful confirmation of her fears in the other's averted face. She caught her breath, and turning to her slower-witted husband, laid her trembling old hand upon his. There was a long silence. He was caught in the masonry, said the visitor at length, in a low voice. Caught in the masonry, repeated Mr. White in a dazed fashion. Yes, he said, staring blankly out at the window and taking his wife's hand between his own. Pressed it as he had been wont to do in their old courting days nearly 40 years before. He was the only one left to us, he said, turning gently to the visitor. It is hard. The other coughed and rising walked slowly to the window. The room wished me to convey their sincere sympathy. With you in your great loss, he said, without looking around, I beg that you will understand. I am only their servant and merely obeying orders. There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring, and her breath inaudible. On the husband's face was look such as his brain the surgeon might have carried into his first action. I was to say that Mau and Magents disclaim all responsibility, continued the others. They admit no liability at all, but in consideration of your son's service, they wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation. And Mr. White dropped his wife's hand, and rising to his feet, gazed with a look horror at the visitor. His dry lips said the word. How much? £200 was the answer. Unconscious of his wife's shriek, the old man smiled faintly, put out his hand like a sightless man, and dropped a senseless heap to the floor. In the Hackney cemetery, some 2 miles distant, the old people buried their dead and come back to a house steeped in shadow and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it, and remained in a state of expectation as though of something else to happen. Something else which was to lighten this load, too heavy for old heart to bear. But those days passed, and expectation gave place to resignation, the hopeless resignation of the old, something miscalled apathy. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days were along to weariness. It was about a week after that the old man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in the darkness, and the sound of subdued sweeping came to the window. He raised himself in bed and listened. Come back, he said tenderly. You will be cold. It is colder for my son, said the old woman, a web of rest. The sound of her sobs died away of his ear. The bed was warm, of his eyes heavy with sleep. He dozed fitfully, and then slept until a sudden cry from his wife awoke him with a start. The monkey's paw, she cried wildly. The monkey's paw. He started up in alarm. Where? Where is it? What's the matter? She said, stumbling across the room toward him. I want it, she said quietly. You've not destroyed it? It's the parlor of the bracket, he replied, marveling. Why? She cried and laughed together, and bending over, kisses his cheek. And then, I only just thought of it, she said hysterically. Why didn't I think it before? Why didn't you think it before? And why didn't you think of it? Think of what? He questioned. The other two wishes, she replied rapidly. We've only had one. Was not that enough? He demanded fiercely. And no, she cried triumphantly. Well, have one more. Go down and get it quickly, and wish our boy alive again. The man sat up in bed and flung the bedclothes from his quaking limbs. Good God, you are mad, he cried aghast. And then, get it, she panted. Get it quickly, and wish. Oh, my boy, oh, my boy, she said. Her husband struck a match and lit a candle. Get back to bed, he said unsteadily. You don't know. What are you saying? We had the first wish granted, said the old woman fiercely. Why not the second? A coincidence, stormily the old man. Go and get it, and wish, cried the old woman, and dragged him toward the door. He went down in the darkness and felt his way to the parlor, and then the mantelpiece, the talisman, was in place, and a horrible fear that the unspoken was might bring his mutilated son before him, or he could escape from the room seized upon him, and he caught his breath as he found that he was lost the direction of the door. His brow cooled with sweat. He felt his way around the table and groped along the wall until he found himself in a small passage with the unwholesome things in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed exchanged. She entered the room. It was white and expectant, and to his fears seemed to have an unnatural upon it. He was afraid of her. Wish, she cried in a strong voice. It is foolish and witch, he faltered. Wish, repeated his wife, and Mr. White said, he raised his hand, I wish my son alive again. The talisman fell to the floor, and he regarded it suddenly. Then he sank trembling into a chair as the old woman, with burning eyes, walked to the window and raised the blind. He sat until he was chilled with a cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle end, which had burned below the rim of the china candlestick, was throwing pulsating shadow on the ceiling and walls. until with a flicker larger than the rest it expired. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at a failure of the talisman, crept back to his bed, and a minute or two afterward the old woman came silent and apathetically beside him. Neither spoke, but both lay silent and listened to the ticking of the lock. A stair creaked, and a squeaky mouse scurried noisily through the wall. The darkness was oppressive, and after lying for some time squaring up his courage, the husband took the box of matches and striking once went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stair the match went out, and he paused to strike another, and at the same moment a knock, so quiet and stealthy as to be scarcely audible, sounds on the front door. The match fell from his hand. He stood motionless, his breath suspended, until the knock was repeated. Then he returned and fled swiftly back to his room, and closed the door behind him. A third knock sound struck the house. "What's that?" cried the old woman, starting up. "A raid," said the old man, in shaking tones. "A raid, it passed me on the stair." His wife sat up in a bed listening. A loud knock resounded through the house. "It's Herbert!" she screamed. "It's Herbert!" She ran to the door, but her husband was before her, and catching her by the arms, held her tightly. "What are you going to do?" he whispered hoarsely. "It's my boy, it's Herbert!" she cried strongly, mechanically. "I forgot it was 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let go. I must open the door." "For God's sake, don't let it in," cried the old man, trembling. "You're afraid of your own son," she cried, struggling. "Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert. I'm coming," Mrs. White said. There was another knock, and another. The old woman, with a sudden wrench, broke free and ran from the door and go to the room. Her husband followed to the landing and called after his appearingly as they hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle back and the bottom bolt drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket, and the old woman's voice strained and panting. "The bolt," she cried loudly. "Calm down. I can't reach it." But her husband was on his hands and knees, groping weakly off the floor in search of the PAW. "If you could only find it before the thing outside got in." A perfect fully set of knock reverberated through the house, and he heard a scraping of the chair as his wife put it down in a pitsake against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and the same moment he found the monkey's paw, and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair drawn back at the door open, a cold breeze rushed up the staircase, and the stream lamp flickering opposite shone on the quiet and deserted road. Thank you.